Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Glen Scrivener. He is an author, an evangelist, a podcast host, a host of the Speak Life podcast and also a new podcast called Post Christianity. He's the author most recently of the book The Air We Breathe, which is about the Christian roots of Western moral ideas. We spoke about that at length. We started by talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's recent conversion to Christianity, the responses to it. Then we spoke about the conflict between progressivism and Christianity, particularly on issues of abortion and euthanasia. And then in the extended part of the episode, we spoke about Jordan Peterson's work on the Bible and what church leaders can learn from his example. That extended version of the episode can be found at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the back catalogue of paywalled episodes, the bonus episodes I record fortnightly with my husband, and also the MMM chat community. Remember, Maiden Mother Matriarch is a subscriber-supported show. I am entirely dependent on your generosity in the form of paid subscriptions to keep the camera running, keep the lights on. So any support that you can offer would be enormously appreciated so that we can keep producing the podcast. Enjoy. So, Glen, we're talking a couple of weeks after Ayaan Hirsi Ali's piece in Unheard, which I think was titled Why I'm Now a Christian, which has been the source of a lot of discussion. Some of it I thought quite annoying.
Yeah, right.
and I wondered what you made of it, because I actually thought of you as I was reading it, and I thought, I'm sure Glen is going to have views on this, because the thing that's really interesting about about her piece, which of course doesn't necessarily portray the entirety of her reasons for conversion or her own sort of emotional relationship with Christianity or anything, is that she puts a lot of emphasis on the sort of cultural achievements of Christianity and much less emphasis on her own personal, emotional pull towards it.
Yeah. So I really feel for Ayaan because, she has been a part of the only three religions in the history of the world that have ever cared about whether people leave them or join them. And her entire life story has been either leaving or joining. The only three religions in the world that have ever cared, which is Islam, Christianity, and the new atheism. And I think when you saw people like Michael Shermer and Richard Dawkins respond to Ayaan's kind of announcement, you got to see that they are a proselytizing religion as well. And they are very, very disappointed that one of their own has defected. So I thought her article, I wonder whether the pace of the article was forced by the ARC conference that she spoke at maybe 2 weeks before that, a conference that you were at, Louise, and I was there as a punter. And Jordan Peterson at that point sort of seemed to out her a little bit. And interestingly, she was sitting between two Christians. And the topic of the panel conversation was all about the better story that we can tell in the West. And we've kind of gotten cut off from our roots. And how do we restore a sense of self in the West? And actually, the two people on either side of her, there was John Anderson, who is a Christian and a big sort of YouTuber now. He was the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. And Os Guinness, author of dozens and dozens of books. And he is with Jordan Peterson on his sort of Exodus series on the Daily Wire. But he is also a Christian. So she's flanked by two Christians, neither of whom are naming Christianity as the foundation of the West. And yet Ayaan was the one who constantly was sort of pointing back to, no, there is she first up says, Christianity is at the root of these things. And then she sort of corrects herself and she does the sort of civilizational speak and says the Judeo-Christian worldview. Interesting that her first instinct was to say the root of our civilization is Christianity. And then Jordan Peterson kind of outs her and her husband a little bit by saying, I know that you and your husband are on a bit of a spiritual journey, aren't you? And she sort of comes out a little bit on stage at the ARC conference in front of 1,500 people. And then 2 weeks later, she writes the article for Unheard, Why I Am Now a Christian, which is a play on Bertrand Russell's article, Why I Am Not a Christian. And both on stage at ARC and in this article, she mentions Tom Holland many times. And in the article, she talks about the marvelous or the wonderful Tom Holland and the wonderful book Dominion. And I think that's clearly been a massive part in whatever spiritual journey that she's on, which frames what she means by civilizational Christianity. I don't think she's just a kind of a neocon reactionary who is clinging onto Christianity to make some political points. There's been a lot of cynical kind of reaction to Ayaan on Twitter, and people saying, they rephrase her entire argument. Why I'm a Christian? Geopolitics. You're like, no, it's not. It's not that. She's on the Tom Holland train, and she is noticing that she is already a believer in all sorts of things, all sorts of liberal values and human rights and equality and compassion and all sorts of things. And she's pulling at the threads of the beliefs she already has and coming to see that there is something foundational to them in, you might say, the Judeo-Christian tradition, you might say Christianity, you might say Jesus. And certainly on my side of things, there are lots of Christians saying, why doesn't she just name Jesus? And she's not being sufficiently clear about her Christianity. And all those Christians are missing the fact that on a public stage, the two Christians on either side of her didn't name Jesus either. She's actually come out with articulating the better story in a lot more Christian sense than a lot of the Christians who are at the ARC conference. I think she's doing beautifully as a public witness for Christianity right now. And what I love about it is she finishes the article by saying, I learn a little bit more each Sunday as I go to church. And what I love about that is that she is not she's not like a neocon coming in and saying, if you want to be really anti-woke, I guess you better come into the church. And here are 17 things the church needs to do to up its game, right? About standing against the madness out there. She's not doing that at all. And her whole posture seems to be, I'm learning a little bit more each Sunday. And that warms the cockles of my heart. So, yeah, how did you respond to Ayaan?
I also was quite prickled by some of the more unwelcoming takes that I saw from some Christians, which were, as you say, basically accusing her of being cynical in her conversion, which I don't think there was no indication in anything she wrote that she was being cynical. I think there was an indication, and actually there was a very interesting essay about this on Pascal Emmanuel Gobry's Substack, which I shared on Twitter, that she was leading less with the sort of belief in the metaphysical and leading more with uh, the the respect for the culture that Christianity has created. And for some people, that was considered suspect. But the point that Gobry made, which I thought was very good, is that actually that idea of emotional conversion is one, very Protestant, and two, relatively recent vintage. The idea that of actually Christianity being something that you do, you go to church, you behave as a Christian, you perform your religion outwardly as being the primary thing, is probably a more traditional way of regarding conversion rather than this kind of intimate relationship with Christ. You could have an intimate relationship with Christ and never go to church, according to that kind of view of it, and you would be just as sincere a Christian as anyone else, which I thought was very interesting. And I also found, as I mentioned on Twitter, sort of reassuring, because as I've said on this podcast several times, I'm probably religious but not spiritual. That's probably the best way of describing my relationship with
You and Nick
Christianity.
Cave. Yeah, yeah.
Right, like
Yeah.
I share Ayaan's wonder at the sort of achievements of Christian civilization, and I share what you describe in The Air We Breathe as these kind of fundamental Christian ideas, which are so fundamental that we don't even see them for being Christian. The idea that mercy is good, the idea that the weak should be protected, not persecuted, all these kind of things which seem to be so fundamental to Western morality, but are in fact derived from Christianity. That's all true. What I don't have is that feeling of having a personal relationship with Christ. I don't. I have looked for that emotional spark and I haven't found it. Which doesn't mean that I won't ever find it, but it does mean that, like at this point, I can't say I've never had whether I had this conversation with a friend recently actually about whether or not it would be wonderful to have a Damascene conversion. I thought it might be to have that like incredible moment of certainty. She thought it would be terrible. She says as a pious Catholic, because she's like, no, it would turn your life completely upside down, and it would be terrifying and awful. No, thank you. But like, for better or worse, I've not had. I don't feel that emotional thing that so many people, so many Christians apparently feel. And I found it sort of reassuring to read Godbury's account of it and say, actually, maybe that's not what matters. Maybe wanting to be a Christian and behaving as a Christian is what matters.
Yeah, I mean, so like in the Bible, there are two conversions that happen on a road, and one of them is the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus. And there's a great bright shining light as Paul is about to drag off some Christians to prison because he's a Pharisee and he's trying to like stop this incipient Christian movement. And the road to Damascus is an intervention in the most dramatic sense, and he's converted on the spot. That's a Damascene conversion. But there's another famous road of conversion, and it's the Sunday, Easter Sunday, and there's a couple who are walking back to Emmaus, a town outside Jerusalem. And on the road to Emmaus, it's this beautiful scene where Jesus shows up incognito, and he just starts this conversation with them, and it warms the cockles of my heart just to like I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about Jesus pretending not to be Jesus for a bit, and just eavesdropping in on a conversation with these two who had followed Jesus, and then he gets crucified, and then they think, well, Jesus is dead and buried, the movement is over, back to Emmaus for us. And he starts a conversation with them, and they say, are you only a visitor to town before you don't understand what's going on with Jesus? And then Jesus himself says, what things? What's happened this weekend? And he gets them to sort of have this conversation. And then he says, but isn't this what was meant to happen according to the scriptures? Wasn't the Christ meant to sort of suffer first and then rise again from the dead? And, nothing changes at that moment either. And then there's this beautiful line where it says, this is in Luke chapter 24, if anyone wants to look it up. And there's this wonderful moment where they get to their house, and it says Jesus like made like he was intending to go on, and then they invite him in. And then it's like, oh well, if you insist, I'll come on inside. And then Jesus sits down and he has a meal with them, and then they break bread. And as he prays, and it's this very sacramental moment like the night before he died, where he says, this is my body given for you. As the bread is broken, their eyes are opened, and Jesus disappears from their sight. And then they say, did not our hearts burn within us while we were on the road? And I just find that fascinating because it's a long, slow burn. I mean, it happened over a matter of hours, but I think sort of in terms of the pattern of what is going on, it's nothing like the Damascus Road. It involves, Jesus kind of incognito coming up and coming alongside people. And I've always loved that idea in which of the Narnia books is it where Aslan talks to somebody about it's The Horse and His Boy, isn't it? Where you get the idea that there might be some lions that are after him, and at points that it feels like there are two lions after him. And it's only at the end of the story that Aslan kind of says, I was that lion, and I was that lion, and I was that lion, and I was that lion. I was in the scary parts, and I was in the wonderful parts. And it's that incognito sense of Jesus. And I wonder whether the idea of compassion for the weak and lifting up the lowly and the inviolable worth and dignity of all people and those sorts of things are ways in which Jesus is kind of incognito with you on the journey. And then there is that sense of the scriptures and saying, oh no, but don't the scriptures frame your understanding of everything that's going on? And then that sense, and certainly in the more sacramental churches, they're quite right to notice that it's when the bread is broken that their eyes are opened, and then they recognize their hearts were burning way back on the road. And I think more sacramental churches, and I'm an Anglican, so I try to have the best of both worlds. It's sort of an ancient church. I'm more evangelical in the flavor of Anglicanism that I am. That there is that sense of that there's the scriptures and there's the walking with Jesus, but there's also just the tangible sense of sitting down and going through motions, because we are embodied creatures and we were made for motions, and motions are not inauthentic. Just because our hearts are not burning in the moment. And so, yeah, so I always encourage people, you don't need to necessarily have a road to Damascus. Most people do not have a road to Damascus. Most people, even in the Bible, they're much more a road to Emmaus. It's much more a slow burn, I would think.
Or indeed a recognition, as Ayaan describes, and as, Tom Holland describes and you described, of realizing that actually you were sort of Christian all along. Maybe not in the belief in the metaphysics, but belief in the moral ideas, the worldview, all of that. That is so deeply Christian without us even realizing it. Although, I mean, this is it's something I've written about a little bit and thought about a lot. The extent to which that is still true in what we might want to call progressivism or wokeism, there clearly are very, very strong Christian themes in progressivism. I mean, if nothing else, just the whole idea of progress, right, is drawn from a Christian worldview, the arc of the moral universe, yada yada. But it also seems to me that progressivism, for some reason, which hopefully we might get onto, is very vulnerable to being sort of paganized. So I wrote this piece for First Things a few months ago about abortion and the importance of abortion to Christianity, in the sense that prizing the vulnerable, protecting the vulnerable from the very beginning as an extremely important Christian principle, and Christians right from the beginning were objected to infanticide and abortion in the Roman world, and that has persisted ever since. And so basically, therefore, if you move to legalize abortion, particularly late-term abortion and so on, you are in a sense rejecting Christian doctrine. And so when people argue about abortion, what they're really arguing about is Christianity, and whether Christianity should remain the state religion. And progressivism is clearly indebted to Christian ideas in some sense, but progressivism is also extremely pro-choice,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and extremely pro-euthanasia, and all sorts of other things which are really, really not okay within the sort of Orthodox
Yeah.
Christian framework. What
Yeah.
do you think's going on there in terms of the evident inconsistencies
Mm.
within this kind of, I don't know, is it that progressivism, having lost the grounding of the church, has become kind of open to disintegration, or is
Yeah.
there some
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
explanation for?
Well, I think so. I talk in The Air We Breathe about 7 values of the kingdom, which are kind of the fruit of the Jesus Revolution, which are things like equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. But I think detached from
Very well
their
done remembering
Christian,
all your chapters. I can't do
I've done this before. um,
that.
Ain't my first rodeo. And so that those 7 values, and that's the thing, they're sort of fruit of a specific gospel that goes out to the world, but you detach it from its roots, and then they just become values that stand over you, and they become detached from the story in which they make sense. There's a story and there's a moral to the story, and the moral are, these 7 values and many more. But to detach it from the story, you just end up with the morals, and then you just end up with moralism. And I quote in the book, there's a famous Baptist preacher in the 19th century called C.H. Spurgeon, and he said, if you are half a Christian, you'll be the most miserable creature in the world, because you will get all the values, but you won't get actually the Jesus who is the source of those values, and you won't get the one who can forgive you when you fail at those
Mm,
values, because that's absolutely fundamental
mm,
to Christianity. It's not that you have values that you live out, it's that you realize that you fall short of those values. But if values are at the top of the hierarchy, values cannot forgive you, values can only judge you. You need a person in order to forgive you. Only persons forgive. And if you kind of dethrone Christ and enthrone the values, then you have what G.K. Chesterton called the Christian virtues run amok. And what we have nowadays is these Christian virtues run amok. And I mentioned like the first three virtues of equality, compassion, and consent. I think Christianity gave us this sense of there is no longer any male or female or Jew or Greek or slave or free. We are all one in Christ Jesus, is Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. But you detach that from the story, and it's less like we are all equally welcome around the same table. It's more like we are all individuals who have a right to be equally far up our own individual ladders. And like Larry Seidentop is this political philosopher who sort of was one of the inspirations for The Air We Breathe. But he talks about the invention of the individual, and absolutely sort of Christendom invented the individual in the sense that we understand the individual in modern Western society. But therefore, Christians are also on the hook for inventing individualism and all that atomization. And so equality becomes individualism. And then the second virtue I talk about is compassion. And we've learnt from the parable of the Good Samaritan that we are not meant to walk on by, that the guy beaten up by the side of the road is our brother too, and is our neighbor too, and we are meant to love that person and show compassion for that person. But in a society that actually does prize victims so much, sometimes we don't want to help victims, sometimes we just want to be victims. And then you get competitive victimhood. And then the third value that I talk about in the book is consent, especially in the sexual realm. And that, the first sexual revolution was 1900 years before the swinging 60s, and Christianity absolutely gave to the world that the sense that there is an inviolability to wills and bodies that must not be violated, and that the rightness or wrongness of a sexual act is not about the social standing of the person you're having sex with, um, but in and of themselves, even if she is a concubine or a slave or a prostitute or the scullery maid, whoever she is, an elite man does not have the right um, to sexual conquest, and consent is put right at the heart of the sexual relationship. Now, divorce that from Christianity, and again, nowadays consent is pretty much the only virtue that we are clinging on to in the sexual realm. And so choice in sexual matters becomes absolutely primary. So now you weave those three things back together. You've got radical individualism, you've got competitive victimhood, and you've got choice as king in the sexual realm. And you've got the madness that we see all around us. And it's a madness that is unthinkable without the Christian Revolution. It's a madness that uses a lot of Christian phrases and uses the cachet that Christianity has given to those phrases, but they are being wielded for very pagan ends. And just on abortion as well. I mean, you're right. You couldn't think of a less Christian thing than infanticide or abortion in that sense, because they are the weakest, the least, the last, and the lost among us. We must preserve and protect them, and not cast them off, even though it's a human universal, really. Like infanticide pretty much is a human universal. Tacitus noticed a couple of German tribes that didn't practice it, and that was noteworthy to him. He was like, what? You don't kill your girls? You don't kill your disabled? That's weird. Because Jews and Christians had always stood against infanticide, and I think it's a profoundly Christian thing to do. Now, what's interesting is that on the pro-choice side of things, even though they're arguing for what I would think is a kind of infanticide by extension, they're using profoundly Christian language to do it. They are foregrounding choice and consent, and which comes from that consent thing, and they are foregrounding it's healthcare. Well, who invented the hospitals, right? They're foregrounding the equality of the sexes and women's rights, and the bodily autonomy of the woman, and all those sorts of things. And so what has happened with Christianization is, I might wish as a Christian that the Christianization had gone more deeply, more thoroughly. It has definitely done a number on us in terms of our moral intuitions at a surface level, and the language that we use, even as we are going down certain pagan routes, we can't help but do so with Christian-ish justification. And again, as a Christian, you won't be surprised to learn. I think the answer is to return to Jesus, return to the story, and let's surrender ourselves to that. But we are this strange mixture of Protestant and pagan. And I've got a podcast with Andrew Wilson called Post Christianity, and people can check out. We've got an episode on this sort of interplay of the West, the modern, late modern 21st century West is a kind of this weird mixture of Protestant and pagan.
Yes, I think that's true. It's a good point about the defenses of abortion. What you will almost never hear is anyone defending the pro-choice position by saying that unwanted infants are worthless. That there's something despicable and disposable about a disabled child or whatever. What you will hear more often is to say that they're not infants, right?
Yep. Yep.
Because they're unborn, which is absolutely not, say, the Roman justification for infanticide and
Yeah.
abortion. It's
Yeah.
that it's like practically expedient to dispose of unwanted children, not that they are in some sense not children. So yeah, you're right that it's being justified within a Christian framework. Ditto euthanasia. People will say that it's a merciful thing to do, euthanasia, not that sick and disabled people are a drain on resources and a waste of space, which would be the more sort of authentically pagan.
Pragmatic and realistic
Yes.
and simply Darwinian.
Yeah. I think that the line that either you or Andrew used on the post-Christian on that episode about Protestantism and paganism, which I thought was great, was if you're a Christian being beaten with a stick, that is, you're not being merciful enough, you're not being equal enough, whatever it is, you're in a sense being beaten by your own stick. Right? Like, so your political opponents are using your own terms against you, which, in a sense is a sort of vindication of the terms themselves, even if you are being beaten up in the moment. What's more difficult, of course, is people who don't hold to those values at all. One of the things that I worry about in terms of the future of de-Christianization, if it continues as it is, I don't actually think that progressivism or wokeism or whatever is the key threat to Christianity, because as you say, it is. They still basically have the same moral framework as Christians, even if it's confused. In a sense, actually, like progressives are almost Herodotus at the gates, like defending these principles of equality and mercy and so on against ideologies that don't value those at all. I'm partly thinking about some kind of futurist transhumanist stuff that, say, Mary Harrington writes about, which really doesn't see a line that Mary Harrington has written somewhere, which I think about a lot, is it's relatively easy to persuade the post-Christian right, if we want to call them that, people who hold to right-wing ideas but really don't sign up to the Christian moral framework. It's easy enough to persuade them not to create monsters through biotech. They tend not to be in favor of, say, sex reassignment surgeries because it seems to be so sort of self-evidently bad for the people who undergo them. What's hard, though, is to persuade them not to create supermen and to use biotech as a form of enhancement, which very quickly leads to some very it quickly leads to some very unchristian places in terms of deeply hierarchical and radical and kind of warring against nature and all this kind of stuff. That is on the horizon, and I don't feel as though many progressives are even looking at that. Like, they're kind of facing backwards and not even thinking about the much more fundamental threats to ideas like equality and mercy, to which they share with Christians.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a famous kind of little clip from Yuval Noah Harari's TED Talk, where in the Q&A he is asked. So he wrote *Sapiens* about our history, our evolutionary history to date, and then *Homo Deus* about how we might continue to evolve past Homo sapiens and become Homo Deus. And in the Q&A of this TED talk that was kind of a summary of Sapiens, um, he was asked, with all the technological changes, what should be the future for those who can't keep pace with the technological change. And he just said, drugs and computer games should keep them happy. And that seems to be the best answer
Yeah.
for them. And fascinatingly,
The
in
Matrix,
his
basically.
yeah, the Matrix. Why not? Or Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
Just yeah, like let's have a brave new world. And um, during his talk, he at this TED talk, he says human rights are not found as a biological reality. They are just found in the stories that we have told. Those stories might be great stories, but they are just stories that involve the gods. And he's very clear, certainly in Sapiens, that it's from the Bible, that we get this sense of humanity made in God's image, and that's where we got the idea of human rights. And when we get rid of the God story, we're going to get rid of the human rights story as well. And at that stage, what people then want to do is they want to say, oh no, we can grant ourselves rights. We can grant ourselves dignity, can't we? At which point you want to ask, who's we? And the very dystopian answer to that is, like, whoever has the technological will and power to do it. They have the right to confer on whatever subset of biological reality, the pinnacle of, and they can grant themselves those rights, and the rest of us can take the hindmost. So, on what grounds can we say that humanity as such has value? And I honestly can't come up with a better answer than God the human, who takes humanity to himself and through the cross and resurrection raises it up and puts humanity at the top of the hierarchy, and puts humanity as such, human nature as such, because he takes our nature, and therefore you can't sort of divide up human nature into the Homo Deus and Homo sapiens and have those concentric circles of meaning if you have humanity as such taken up by somebody who is beyond the human. And therefore, if human rights are in the hands of anyone that is human themselves, then they have the right to narrow the circle. um, Only if you've got God the human, actually, do I think you have the the philosophical grounding for any kind of humanism whatsoever. And so, even as a Christian, I'm absolutely a humanist, and I think a massive argument moving forwards, with all sorts of dystopian futures open to us, is like, what is the human, and is there a future for the human? And some Christians might hear me say that and say, "Oh, Glen's leaving aside his Christianity." I'm saying, no, I'm actually pointing to the one the one hope we've got for a humanism that actually honors all those to the very fringes of human society. And at that point, I start to sound quite like a fundamentalist, because I'm saying it's a kind of Christ or the pit. It's like you go with this Jesus thing, or you go to some very to my way of thinking, some very hellish alternatives. It sounds quite fundamentalist, but I do think philosophically that's where we're at. It's Christ or the pit.
Yeah, I find those alternatives instinctively hellish as well, which I think speaks of my own Christian assumptions. Even if, as we've discussed, whether or not I kind of emotionally completely sign up to the metaphysics of it, I do sign up to the view that actually there's something very terrifying about abandoning, that humanistic idea, which is not, humanism is not the counterpart to Christianity, right? It's just, it's not at all obvious to people from non-Christian cultures that these things that we feel to be instinctively true are true. Not at all. And and that's Ayaan, going back talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she writes of Tom Holland's book Dominion as being very, very important in her Christian conversion, because it is a revelatory book to people who don't recognize how deep seated these Christian ideas are. Tom's coming on the podcast in the new year, by the way.
Hey,
Yeah, we'll we will get into such things. No, he's probably sick to death of talking about dominion, so I might have mercy on him.
Talk about
We
Pax
can,
instead. Yeah.
yeah, we can talk
Yeah.
about the Romans instead. Another fear that I have, given given our shared assumptions about the fundamental Christian ideas being good ones, is that Christianity's is that there are certain elements within the Christian framework which are vulnerable to tearing down the edifice accidentally, right? So we've spoken about individualism as a consequence of Christianity, and individualism being a challenge to Christianity in its most extreme form. Something I also worry about is Christian compassion, the Christian commitment to the Good Samaritan story, leading to actually the destruction of Christendom through mass migration. You know where I'm headed with this. I'm thinking of Douglas Murray's writings on A Strange Death of Europe, which is now like a decade old or something, where he's been largely vindicated in the sense that Christian mercy shown towards people who want to come to Europe is not a, it's not a, I want to say it's not a bad thing, in that the instinct is a good one, but the potential consequences of it longer term really do pose an existential threat to Christianity. I mean, that's my view of it. I don't know if you agree, but it's another example of that, of elements within Christianity which are potentially present almost a sort of autoimmune disease threat
Mm, mm, mm.
to the
Yeah.
to the religion
Yeah.
itself.
Yes, I mean, because compassion is it's not, it doesn't yet rise to the level of a virtue. It's more an instinct, isn't it? Compassion. Um, it certainly is the number one way that Jesus' emotional life is described in the Gospels. It's this word splagthani, which is related to the word for spleen. Like we get the word spleen from. It's this gut wrenching pity, this mercy. And the number one way of describing the emotional life of Jesus is that he had gut-wrenching pity and compassion, and that's what the Good Samaritan felt when he saw the man by the side of the road. But you cannot yet design a morality around a feeling. You've got a lot more work ahead of you to do that. I was walking my daughter to school the other day, and it had just rained and there was a slug on the pavement, and my daughter said, "Oh, Daddy, quick, save the slug, save the slug." I was like, "What do you want me to do?" She said, "Well, we'll just pick him up and put him on the grass." So I was like, "Okay, well, you could. Why don't you pick him up?" And she said, "Ew, he's disgusting. I don't want to do that." I was like, "Well, okay, this is interesting. You want to? How much compassion do you have? What's that?" And there's the compassion of an 8-year-old, and bless her cotton socks. Like she like very much wants to show pity, and she had some kind of gut-wrenching feeling, but at some stage you've got to kind of roll up your sleeves and do do the dirty work as well if you are going to actually help the situation. And I remember I even wrote about this, like, at Oxford. I did the Blaggers degree at Oxford, PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, at um, yeah, at a kind of quite right on kind of college. And I remember even writing in an article on an essay on politics about how Margaret Thatcher once commented on the parable of the Good Samaritan. She said, "The thing you notice about the Good Samaritan is he couldn't have done any of that if he didn't have money." And I still remember hearing that as an undergraduate and thinking, "Oh, you witch! How could you?" Like, and now I'm 45 years old. I'm starting to,
Yeah.
I'm, I'm
Yes.
starting to see that actually she does. It's not just a clever point that the Good Samaritan had to have the money to pay for the hotel and like take care of the guy. There's actually a theological point there too, because ultimately the Good Samaritan is a portrait of Christ and his compassion on us who are in the gutter. And it does take someone from on high to stoop. You can't stoop if you're in the gutter. You've got to have a certain sense of strength in order to offer compassion. I can't turn the other cheek to you from weakness. Like the weak thing to do would actually just to run and hide. I can't prefer you to me. I can't let you through the door. I can't even say, after me, if it's not that I'm actually first in line, right? like the exercise of Christian virtues actually requires a certain strength and requires a certain position, requires certain resources in order to do them. Um, and I don't think the Christian position on immigration is simply, to have open borders and to say to the world, whatever is written on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, come you weak, you poor, you huddled masses. And um, that is a lovely instinct, and I think there are some Christian origins to it, but it's a little bit like my daughter saying, can you save the slug? Like, yes, I'd like to. It will require more from us than simply to have that feeling. Now, on the actual demographic thing, I think it will be interesting what immigration does to Britain. London, for instance, the London diocese within the Church of England is one of the only parts of the Church of England that's growing, and a lot
That's
of
true.
that's to do with immigration.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there will be parts of Europe and parts of North America that are quite Christianized by immigration from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which are going gangbusters in terms of gospel and conversions. So there'll be some parts that are very much more Christianized, and some parts that are very much more Islamicized. And then you're like, oh gosh, it will be a very different Britain in the coming decades. But I think you're absolutely right. The Christian position on immigration is not simply to have an open border and let absolutely everybody in. And I think Christians need to hear that as much as others.
I go to a few different churches in a slightly like haphazard way, partly because, as we were talking about before, we started the recording. We're moving house soon, so I'm kind of like I don't want to like fully invest in a church only to move house. But anyway, that's another story. But um, one of the churches I take my son to quite regularly is charismatic Anglican, and it's a great church and it's great for kids and he really enjoys it. And if I tell him we're going to church, he says, oh, the church with the slide, because it's got a really great slide in the creche, and as far as he's concerned, like that's a great day out. So I thought, okay, fine. I mean, I want him to enjoy himself, but anyway, this is a church we often go to. And I actually found after the 7th October attacks in Israel, I couldn't bring myself to go that day. And the reason I couldn't bring myself to go is because I really didn't want to hear a sermon about forgiveness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I thought
Yeah.
that I might, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
and I actually found that moment I was like, I cannot for all of the for all that I agree with the Christian instincts towards mercy and compassion, I also want Christians to defend. I also think that necessitates defending the weak from those who would destroy the weak,
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think all too often in kind of the liberal end of Christianity, that gets forgotten, and it's exclusively turn the other cheek, and exclusively, be welcoming to, whatever, provide like a British passport to Hamas leaders living in London on taxpayers, whatever. I'm slightly exaggerating, but like not by much. There is that end of liberal Christianity which is so almost self-abnegating, like almost welcoming actually those who despise Christian virtues, and it I find I that's actually it's funny. Like normally the Church of England in particular is so eager to sort of be more and more liberal in an attempt to attract 31-year-olds like me, whereas I'm actually like, no, I'm too conservative for you guys. Like,
Yeah.
please have some balls. It's almost what like
Yeah.
I'm crying out for some Christian churches. But I mean, you can see why there's the conflict. Like the Gospels are not clear on this question, at least from my reading of it. Like there is an enormous room for doubt and for debate on many of these questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there is that time in Luke's gospel where they say we've got a couple of swords, and Jesus says that's enough. And like, does he mean that's enough of violence, or does he mean two swords will do?
Yeah.
um, and certainly, and the church kind of had it out in the early centuries, and the consensus in the early church seems to go very strongly towards pacifism, while Christianity was absolutely a minority. But come Constantine, um, post Constantine, you get people like Augustine who have it out intellectually about just war as opposed to pacifism, and and I think there's a sort of a there's a backbone and a spine to Augustine's views on just war and when force is necessary. But it is tempered by the just war tradition, in which Augustine kind of invents, really, um, in which compassion can be shown within war. Right, there is a just way, and you don't torture or execute your prisoners of war, and there's a just cause for war, and there's justice within war, and there's all sorts of. But you can still go to war, says Augustine, and but I totally get that. I was on Twitter. I saw there's quite a progressive vicar who retweeted some street preachers, and it seemed to me like the street preachers might have come from outside the UK, and there's one black guy kind of preaching Jesus to a bunch of pro Hamas supporters, and he was saying like Jesus is the true peace, Jesus is the true peace. But this quite progressive vicar just said, little do these preachers know that Christianity was behind the colonization that is at the cause of all this problem. And you're like, and what was interesting to me is that actually the street preachers are very robustly courageous in proclaiming peace to pro-Palestinian marchers. And they want to see conversion of those pro-Palestinian marchers. And they're not going along with Tommy Robinson to kind of, be stronger than them. They're doing a kind of a turn the other cheek thing. And to me, the coward is the progressive vicar. And there's a robustness to the compassion and the cheek-turning love of the street preacher who, however foolishly we might think, is sort of meeting a pro-Palestine protest with the simplicity of preaching. But I think there is robustness to turning the other cheek. That it's not strike back, and it's not run away. And I think that's one thing that people get wrong about turning the other cheek. It's not cowering away, and it's not lashing back. There's an immense strength to standing full square and saying, "You struck me once, and it hasn't done what you thought it would do, has it? Now let's deal with this relationship." There's a robustness to turning the other cheek, and I think street preachers kind of can model it. And one other thing is you're absolutely right that my thesis in the book is about the Christianization of culture, but what you're pointing to here is very much culture washes back the other way to the church, and the church needs to be very wary of picking up the compassion that has been handed to us by a world that has divorced compassion from its gospel roots, and the church is in all sorts of danger of picking up anti-Christian ideas of compassion and then reflecting them back to the world. Yeah.
And in doing so, it seems to me, not that I'm running PR for the Church of England, although my emails are open, that progressives who have decided not to go to church are not going to be persuaded by the church wooing them by being more progressive, because what they don't like, what they explicitly reject, is the whole idea of tradition. It's this like perpetual revolution that's built into the progressive ideology. There just isn't a scenario, I think, in which they're going to sign up to a 2,000-year-old tradition of any kind, because that's like anathema to the worldview. So it just seems like you're on an absolute hiding to nothing in attempting to woo that group. Far better to say, actually, there is clearly something. I think this was the line in Gobry's piece that we discussed at the beginning, that to look at a Christian cathedral or at Christian science, this you have this chapter right in the book on why actually scientific method owes a great deal to Christianity. To look at all of these Western cultural achievements and to admire them is in some sense to recognize a profound truth in Christianity. There must be something fundamentally true about an ideology that has produced all of that. That I think is the much more persuasive argument for people who have strayed from the church, not trying to forget or reject all of that. Or, oh God, I was looking, appropriately enough. Hang on, let me start that again without blaspheming.
You are forgiven. Ego te absolvo.
I was looking at a church recently for when we moved, and I was like, shopping around on church websites to see which would be good churches to try going to, and I was quite interested in a particular church, and then I looked at a page they had on recommended reading. One of the books that they recommended was a book called "Can White People Be Saved?"
Right.
And I was immediately like, I am not bringing my children to this church.
Yeah.
No, no. The answer in it, having read the blurb, the answer is like a reluctant yes. Okay, from this book. Okay, I just thought I do not want to. Yes, like the efforts of that kind of end of Christianity to woo that kind of, I think, really potentially dangerous and destructive ideology. It just seems like a terrible direction for the church to go in.
Yeah. No, completely is. And because I think it's pretty straightforward to uncover the racism of what is purporting to be anti-racist. And again, yeah. So I think it's not because they're trying to be hyper Christian. It's they've re-racialized things in ways that absolutely, setting off your Christian spidey sense right there in completely the right way. But yeah.
That is, yes. Yeah, I mean, yes, we come back to the fact that we've kind of been hit with your own stick, right? The reason that we find a book titled "Can White People Be Saved?" unpalatable is because we think that there's something wrong about racializing religion in that way.
Yeah. In Christ, there is no more barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free, but we are all one in Christ Jesus. That was the thought you had, and that's why I'm always saying, like all our little spidey senses are profoundly Christian. We've just forgotten the Bible references.
Is it your line or Tom Holland's that we're all competing for who gets to be on the cross? That's the kind of
That's my
that's the
Tom's.
victim. That's
But
the
I am
well.
thrilled to
You
be
could
a
have written
part of that sentence.
it. We're all. That's what the kind of victimhood politics is all about. It all comes. Yes, it all
Competitive
comes down to
victimhood
some
and the
of these
oppression
instincts.
Olympics. Yeah, that completely happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Should we talk about 321? Because this
Go
is
on then.
your your new initiative. Do you want to explain to listeners who haven't come across it what it's about and who it's aimed at, I suppose, as well?
Yeah. So if people start to pull at the threads in an Ayaan Hirsi Ali sort of way, in which they think, oh, I think the world has been built in a Christian kind of way, and I think my moral intuitions and sensibilities have been calibrated to the Christian story. It's an opportunity just to have a fresh look at the Christian story. And so, it's Jesus' vision for the world. And so, if you just start with Jesus, this remarkable person who, in the words of Tom Holland, he is the revolutionary who's brought about the most diverse, the most inclusive. No, what does he say? He says Christianity is the most disruptive, the most influential, and the most enduring revolution in human history. And this is just the opportunity to check him out and figure out, what is his vision for God, what is his vision for the world, what is his vision for you. And it starts by looking at his vision for God, and he thinks of himself as the Son of the Father, full of the Spirit, and so that's about the threeness of God, um, Trinity sort of thing. And then his view of the world, he sees himself as the second Adam, coming to put humanity right and take responsibility for the world. And so that's the two-ness of the world. And then oneness is all about you. You are made for a oneness with Jesus, and we sort of explore that through all sorts of interesting illustrations and analogies and animations, and it's completely free, and people can check it out at 321course.com.
How does it compare with Alpha? What's the different strategy of the two?
One thing is you can do it entirely online, and it's sort of made for a digital market because the way anyone explores anything these days is you fall down a YouTube hole, or you binge some documentaries on Netflix, or you listen to podcasts, or um, the way people find anything, whether it's a plumber or whether it's a car mechanic or whether it's God, is they Google it, and so we're trying to have something that really makes sense as an online resource, that goes at your own pace, and there's an online chat community that's attached to it, and there's a little bit of branching narrative that can happen if you want to ask a question. There's a Ask Glenn Anything kind of monthly meetup and that sort of thing. And if you want to read part of John's Gospel in conjunction with doing the course, there's sort of an app that helps you to do that. So it's digitally savvy, but in a sense, Alpha is kind of a Christianity 101, and this is a kind of a Christianity 101. And this is this is done really for the creatively minded person, because we're just immersing people in a whole bunch of stories and saying, imagine you're on a space station and you have no idea how you got there. What are you now thinking? And as soon as you sort of disorient people enough, I think you can then tell them a cool story.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.